On the morning of January 9th, 1946, the large courtroom doors of the Nuremberg tribunal opened into the cold, early winter light of Germany. Wilhelm Keitel, former field marshal and chief of the high command of the Wehrmacht, stepped in. He wore a neatly pressed uniform, silver hair, a stern face, and shoulders held stiffly upright as if he were still at Hitler's military headquarters. But this time, there were no soldiers to welcome him. In front of him were 4 judges from the 4 victorious powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, representing the justice of the entire world. At the center was Geoffrey Lawrence, the British judge, president of the tribunal. Representing the United States was Francis Biddle, former U.S. Attorney General, Iona Nikitchenko from the Soviet Union, a judge who had once signed death sentences for numerous enemies of the people under Stalin. Henri Dondieu de Vabres represented France, stern but deeply committed to legal principles. They all looked toward Keitel, no longer a field marshal, but a war criminal. And it was here that he would have to face the truth. No more Hitler, no army, no soldiers to command. Only a man and his own conscience. Wilhelm Keitel entered the history of World War II as a German field marshal who constantly appeared beside Adolf Hitler, not as a brilliant strategist, but as a shadow who said yes to every whim of the Führer. Within the ranks of the German High Command, Keitel became infamous as Hitler's yes man. He was even mockingly nicknamed La Keitel, a fusion of Keitel and Lakai, German for servant, to emphasize his sycophancy and blind obedience. Indeed, Keitel showed such devotion and submission that Hitler was thoroughly pleased with him. In July 1940, after Germany's lightning victory over France, Keitel praised Hitler as the greatest warrior of all time, and the Führer rewarded him with 250,000 Reichsmarks and a 608-acre estate as a personal gift. To Hitler, Keitel was the ideal subordinate, utterly obedient. Hitler once told his staff that Keitel had the brain of a ticket inspector, but the loyalty of a dog. Field Marshal Hermann Göring also mocked him, saying Keitel had the mind of a sergeant inside the body of a field marshal. Despite being ridiculed behind his back, it was precisely Keitel's blind loyalty that won him Hitler's trust. In 1938, after the Blomberg-Fritsch affair, Hitler purged the conservative generals and assumed direct command over the Wehrmacht. Keitel was unexpectedly appointed Chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces, OKW, a decision that shocked many officers at the time. The reason was clear. Hitler needed a subordinate who was weak-willed and incapable of defiance. As General Alfred Jodl would later remark at Nuremberg, no influential figure ever existed or could exist beside Hitler. From that point on, Keitel became Hitler's faithful transmitter of orders, a role he himself admitted. Every military directive from Hitler was signed and issued by Keitel. Throughout the war, Keitel rarely opposed his superiors. On the contrary, he helped Hitler isolate the military leadership, reporting only what the Führer wanted to hear. For instance, in 1941, upon receiving a report indicating that Germany was not yet ready to invade the Soviet Union, Keitel deliberately withheld it, fearing that bad news might displease Hitler. He also repeatedly signed ruthless orders without question. It was precisely this absolute obedience that made Keitel a dangerous extension of Hitler's will, a loyal executor who helped turn the Führer's wild ambitions into reality. On May 8, 1945, in Berlin, Field Marshal Keitel signed the Instrument of Surrender to the Allies on behalf of the German armed forces, officially ending World War II in Europe. From the height of power, Keitel fell abruptly into the status of a prisoner of war. He was captured by Allied forces in Flensburg, along with the short-lived puppet government of Admiral Dönitz. Keitel and other top-ranking German officers were quickly transferred to Camp Ashcan in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, where they were initially detained before being sent to the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. Even in captivity, Keitel maintained the demeanor of a model German officer. He woke up early, folded his blankets into perfect squares, and requested cleaning supplies to keep his cell tidy. The grey-haired field marshal would snap to attention and click his heels when addressing Allied officers, saluting them respectfully as if he were still reporting to a superior. The camp's prison psychologist, Leon Goldenson, described Keitel as a proper, rule-abiding general who constantly craved recognition. Indeed, even as a war criminal, Keitel behaved with military decorum as though he were still wearing his uniform. But beneath that calm, disciplined exterior lay an inner turmoil. Early in his detention, Keitel was heavily influenced by Reichsmarschall Göring, the highest-ranking defendant among them. At first, Göring played the role of the big brother, angrily forbidding fellow defendants from admitting guilt or saying anything incriminating. On one occasion during a meal, Keitel casually remarked that Hitler's mistakes were the real reason behind the collapse of the Third Reich. Göring immediately snapped at him in rage, causing Keitel to fall silent in fear. In response, the prison authorities later separated the defendants during meals to avoid Göring's psychological domination. From that point on, Keitel began to open up more as if he had finally started to grasp the hopelessness of his own situation. By the end of 1945, the historic Nuremberg trial opened, bringing to justice 24 of the top leaders of Nazi Germany. Keitel was among them, charged with all 4 major counts: conspiracy to commit aggression, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He appeared in court wearing his neatly pressed field marshal uniform, face expressionless. In the courtroom, observers noted how Keitel always sat upright, eyes fixed, his face almost devoid of emotion. That cold, disciplined composure made many shudder. Was it a sign that Keitel felt no remorse, or was he merely hiding fear behind a hardened military facade? In truth, according to those who witnessed him up close, Keitel carried no small burden of conscience. He once quietly asked his defense attorney, if he had the chance to do it all over again, what should he have done? Then, answering his own question, he said, "I would rather have chosen death than let myself be drawn into that vile cycle of crimes again." That late confession revealed that Keitel, at some level, had begun to grasp the horrifying scale of what he had taken part in. Still, in court, the field marshal was forced to confront the stark truth of the Nazi atrocities backed by volumes of damning evidence. When Wilhelm Keitel stepped onto the witness stand at Nuremberg, he did not simply enter a courtroom. He stepped into a moment of history where every word, every glance, every silence carried the weight of millions of lost lives. A field marshal emerging from the ashes of the Third Reich, now standing face to face with what he had spent his military career avoiding: the truth. He stood tall, upright, his uniform still immaculate, but his eyes had lost their authority. They were dim, weary, the gaze of a man who had been lost for too long and no longer knew where he was headed. In front of him was not Hitler, not the High Command, but 4 judges from the 4 victorious powers men who cared nothing for titles and only wanted to know, what did you know and why did you continue? From his very first words, Keitel repeated a phrase he had likely told himself 1,000 times: "I was only a soldier." He said that in 1938, Hitler had taken full control of the military, and from then on, Keitel no longer made decisions. He merely passed them along, signed, delivered orders, a shadow wearing the uniform of a field marshal, a machine trained to obey. But the court was not judging machines, it was judging men. And then the prosecutors began lifting the documents, not accusations, but the very orders bearing his signature. The night and fog decree, the hostage execution policies, the directives for killing prisoners of war. Each sheet was a blade cutting through the armor of administrative duty Keitel had wrapped around himself. And when Soviet prosecutor Rudenko pointed directly at the line, "Human life is completely worthless," every remaining layer collapsed. Keitel tried to keep his voice steady. He admitted that line had been handwritten by Hitler himself on the directive, that he, Keitel, had only suggested 5 to 10 executions in retaliation, But Hitler crossed it out and wrote 50 to 100 instead. The story, seemingly told to shift blame upward, in fact revealed something far more damning. Keitel knew the order was inhumane, and he still signed it. He did not hide his obedience, but he tried to detach himself from the moral weight of the decision. The way he recounted it was like a disciplined secretary, not a man confronting the consequences of mass death. And it was precisely this lack of emotion that made the courtroom feel colder than the winter wind outside. The American prosecutor went further, reading aloud numbers that could not be denied. An internal report sent to Keitel in 1943 by Eastern Minister Rosenberg stated clearly, 3,600,000 Soviet POWs had been captured, and of those, 3 million had died. From hunger, from cold, from being treated as less than human. When asked why the German army refused to apply the Geneva Convention, Keitel replied quietly, "I did not concern myself with it." The courtroom fell silent. Not because the answer was shocking, but because it was numb. It was not a confession, nor even a defense. It was a glimpse into a mindset where human life had long ceased to matter, where the defeated were no longer seen as people. A moral collapse where duty and crime had become indistinguishable. Then came the hardest part, the execution orders, not just for hostages in France and the Netherlands, but for Soviet commissars, captured Allied paratroopers, and resistance fighters in occupied territories. Each directive was read aloud, each phrase, "to be shot on the spot," echoing like a sentence passed on Keitel himself. He did not object. He only repeated slowly, "I was merely passing along orders. They came from the Führer." The French prosecutor would not let it stand. He reread the line, "Human life is cheaper than air," this time more slowly, as if etching it into every wall of the courtroom. Keitel looked down at the table. He sighed and said, "Those dreadful words were not mine. I did not come up with them, but my name is attached to them, and that is a burden I must bear." In that moment, Keitel no longer tried to separate himself from Hitler. He simply realized that he could not. Every attempt to invoke military duty now only underscored the absence of humanity. Because sometimes, blind obedience is the most silent of crimes. In a room without gunfire, without trenches, Keitel, the man who once signed orders for millions of deaths, was defeated by something he had never learned to confront: righteousness. Not from the enemy, but from within himself. He was not forced to kneel, but history made him bow his head, and as he stepped down from the witness stand that day, no one in the room needed to declare him guilty, for he had sentenced himself with his final words, "I have carried that burden, and now I can no longer lay it down." Throughout the trial, Wilhelm Keitel did not deny the fact that he was the one who had signed those orders. But he tried to paint a different image, not as a mastermind, but as a soldier trapped inside a vast machine, a loyal cog so blindly obedient that he was swallowed by the very system he served. "I take responsibility," he said, "but I was only following orders." That was the core of Keitel's defense throughout his testimony, acknowledging his role, but denying intent. He repeatedly invoked the so-called duty of a soldier, the ultimate ideal of discipline in the Nazi military. "Orders are orders," he said again and again. "No choice, no debate, no resistance, only obedience." That was the logic he believed could cleanse some of his guilt, that he was not the one making decisions, but merely executing them. Keitel also turned to politics as a final shield. He was never a member of the Nazi Party, never held a position in the political apparatus. He was only a professional soldier, loyal to the nation, not to any ideology. And in fact, this was true. Keitel did not have a party card, never attended SS conferences, and had no ties to the radical political factions of the Third Reich. The golden badge on his chest was merely an honorary gift from Hitler, not a sworn oath. However, the prosecution did not let that argument stand. Chief U.S. Prosecutor Robert Jackson, with sharp yet calm reasoning, pointed out clearly, it was Keitel's blind obedience that had turned a traditional army into a mass killing machine. not because he planned it, but because he didn't stop it when he could have. Jackson called Keitel a weak and blindly obedient instrument who turned the Wehrmacht into a war machine serving the Nazi Party. That accusation did not thunder like a roar, but stood like a mirror reflecting the true nature of those who allowed evil to thrive by remaining silent. The British prosecutor went further. He flatly rejected Keitel's argument of not knowing the consequences. How could the head of the high command of the German armed forces not know what was happening in Eastern Europe, in the prisoner camps, in the execution sites? How could a man who signed orders stamped with the words "execute immediately" in bold not understand the consequences of his own signature? It is impossible to be ignorant in that position, the prosecutor concluded. The panel of judges agreed. They completely dismissed the notion of following superior orders as a mitigating factor. In a stern declaration, the court concluded, the order of a superior, even to a soldier, cannot be considered a mitigating circumstance when shocking and widespread crimes were carried out consciously, cruelly, and without any justifiable military necessity. In other words, obedience cannot serve as a moral shield. On the contrary, blind obedience was proof that Keitel had traded his conscience for his career, placing formal duty above the line between man and monster. And what's more disturbing is that he did it not out of hatred but in silence. But it wasn't just the prosecutors who spoke. Witnesses came forward as well. Hans Gisevius, a former intelligence officer with the Abwehr and a participant in the plot to assassinate Hitler, gave chilling testimony. Keitel was not as passive as he claimed. He built a psychological wall around Hitler, controlling what information reached the Führer and silencing those who brought bad news. He threatened to punish or hand over to the Gestapo anyone who dared speak the truth, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of losing favor in Hitler's eyes. That testimony cracked further the image of a devoted soldier that Keitel tried so hard to maintain. It showed he was not merely a victim of the system, but a part of its machinery. Even his fellow defendants did not save him from judgment. Goering, the highest-ranking figure among the accused, made no effort to hide his disdain for Keitel. His job was very hard, Goering said. He complained that, despite being a field marshal, he was treated with contempt rather than gratitude. Then he coldly added, but as long as the Führer needed him, he kept doing it. After the war, many other German generals turned their backs on Keitel. Some blamed him for tarnishing the honor of the Wehrmacht, turning a once respected military force into a silent shadow following behind the SS. But others mocked. How many would have dared to be the one who said no? That question was not just for Keitel. It was for everyone who, in history, has stood before a wrongful order and chosen to bow their head. But in Keitel's case, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They had become graveyards. One way or another, before the eyes of history, Keitel could not deny that he had willingly served a tyrant and helped destroy the honor of the German army. On the 31st of August 1946, the Nuremberg trial entered its final stage. Keitel was granted the right to speak his last words before the court deliberated. In this final statement, his voice trembled, though he tried to maintain composure. At the beginning, he accepted his responsibility as chief of the OKW, High Command of the Armed Forces, and stated that he did not wish to lessen my part in what happened. However, Keitel soon resumed his rebuttals against several points raised by the prosecution. He argued that he had not handed over the Wehrmacht to the Nazi Party, as accused, since by 1938, Hitler already held full control of both the party and the military. Keitel insisted that he had no real command authority to lead the army into executing a criminal conspiracy as alleged. He also denied the statement attributed to him that human life is as cheap as dirt, saying, "Those horrific words were not mine. The fact that my name is associated with the Führer's orders is already a heavy burden for me." Despite his evasions, near the end of his final statement, Keitel expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse for the first time. He admitted, "I believed, but I was mistaken, and I failed to stop what should have been stopped. That is my guilt." It is a tragedy to realize that the best I had to offer as a soldier, obedience and loyalty, was exploited for purposes I could not recognize at the time, and I did not see that even a soldier's duty has limits. That is my fate. That late confession, an acknowledgement of blindly serving evil and crossing the moral boundary of a soldier, echoed through the silent courtroom, marking the end of a dramatic phase in the historic trial. The International Military Tribunal deliberated for several days before announcing its verdict on the 1st of October 1946. Wilhelm Keitel was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death by hanging. As the presiding judge read the sentence, Keitel only slightly bowed his head. His face went pale, but he maintained a military posture before quietly turning and leaving the courtroom. The once powerful field marshal was now just a condemned man awaiting his punishment. In the days leading up to his execution, Keitel displayed an eerie calmness. He knew there was no hope, his just following orders defense had failed, and his request for clemency had been denied. His final wish was to be executed by firing squad as a soldier, rather than by hanging like a common criminal. He wrote that, "My guilt stems from a sense of duty, something every army in the world considers a fundamental quality in a soldier." But that request was rejected. The court ruled that his crimes did not merit an honorable death by bullet. Keitel quietly accepted this. He even asked the prison doctor to give the rest of his cigarette ration to fellow inmates, saying that the coming death would be the only release for himself. On the night before his execution, Keitel wrote his final letters to his family. In a letter dated the 3rd of October 1946, addressed to his eldest son, he began, "This may be the last letter your father writes to you," the choked words of a father who knew he had little time left. He urged his children to live on with courage and uphold the family's honor. Keitel also bid farewell to his wife, his companion of nearly 40 years, asking for forgiveness for the pain he had caused their family. Though the full content of these farewell letters was never made public, it is believed that Keitel expressed late remorse and prayed that Germany would one day rise again in peace. In the early hours of the 16th of October 1946, at Nuremberg prison, the death sentence was carried out. Wilhelm Keitel, 64, was called second, after former Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, to ascend the gallows. Under the dim yellow light, Keitel stood tall. As the noose was placed around his neck, he spoke in a deep voice, delivering his final words. "I call upon the Almighty to have mercy on the German people. Over 2 million German soldiers have died for the fatherland. Now, I will follow my sons. All for Germany." His last statement echoed with both pain and a trace of soldierly pride. Keitel believed both his sons had perished in the war. In fact, one survived in a Soviet POW camp and was not released until 1955. The chair beneath his feet was kicked away, but horrifyingly, the American executioner had bungled the job. The rope was too short. Keitel's tall body did not drop hard enough to break his neck immediately. He writhed in the noose, suffocating in agony for over 20 minutes, before death finally came. His slow, painful end mirrored in some small measure the suffering of countless innocent victims who died under the orders he had signed. The curtain fell on Hitler's most loyal servant. From a powerful instrument of madness, Keitel ended his life on the gallows as a condemned war criminal. Looking back on Wilhelm Keitel's journey from the dark war rooms of the Wolfschanze headquarters to the bright courtroom at Nuremberg, one finds a harsh lesson in misplaced loyalty. When confronted with justice, Keitel had to admit that Hitler had exploited his devotion for evil ends. He also realized that blind obedience cannot excuse crimes, that even as a soldier, he should have known there are orders that must never be followed. Keitel's remorse came far too late to save his life, but his final words, "I believed, and I was wrong. That is my guilt," still echo as a warning to future generations. They remind us that we are all morally responsible for our actions, even when we are just following orders. And they show that sometimes the price of blind loyalty is a person's life, honor, and very soul.